Colonialism is a remarkable and often painful chapter in the story of humanity. It's the tale of one nation extending its power far beyond its own borders. Imagine a country reaching out across vast oceans to control distant lands and peoples. Not just drawing lines on a map, reshaping economies, reshaping societies, reshaping how people think about themselves and their world. A story of ambition, power, and profound, lasting change. For centuries, European powers embarked on extraordinary journeys, creating empires that spanned the globe. Their ships carried soldiers, traders, missionaries. The story of French colonialism is one of the most expansive and complex. It begins with tentative steps in the Age of Sail and grows into a colossal global enterprise. France, famed for culture and revolutionary ideals, paradoxically built one of the world's largest empires. Not a single entity, but a patchwork of diverse territories, each with its own story of encounter and subjugation. The French flag was raised across a staggering variety of lands and peoples. To understand this, we travel back in time. Our story begins in the early 17th century. France looked across the Atlantic with eyes full of ambition. England, Spain, the New World promised untold riches, new trade routes, a chance to build a powerful overseas presence. Early French explorers ventured into the cold, vast wilderness of North America. They established settlements called New France, an enormous territory stretched from modern-day Canada down the Mississippi River to Louisiana. They sought furs, timber, a strategic foothold. These early colonies were often precarious, clinging to survival in a harsh, unfamiliar environment. Yet they marked the beginning of France's global imperial dream. North America mattered strategically, but the economic heart lay further south in the warm tropical Caribbean waters. Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, Martinique, Guadeloupe. These islands became vast sugar plantations, producing the so-called white gold in high demand across Europe. This immense wealth was built on a foundation of unimaginable cruelty. France participated in the transatlantic slave trade, forcibly transporting hundreds of thousands across the ocean, men, women, children, in horrific conditions, to live a life of brutal, unpaid labor. Motivations were clear. First, the lure of commerce. The crown sought valuable raw materials, sugar, coffee, indigo. These goods were shipped to France, processed, and sold for huge profit. The mercantilist system enriched the mother country above all else. After the collapse of its first empire, France began to look for new horizons in the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution was transforming Europe, creating an insatiable demand for raw materials, rubber, cotton, minerals. Nations needed new markets to sell their manufactured goods. It was in this context that France turned its attention to Africa. The conquest began in 1830 with the invasion of Algiers, a brutal and protracted conflict that would last for decades. This was the first major step toward a continent-spanning enterprise, marking the birth of France's second, much larger colonial empire. A new kind of colonialism emerged, driven by industrial capitalism and fierce nationalistic competition. This period is known as the Scramble for Africa. From roughly 1880 to the start of the First World War, the great powers of Europe raced to carve up the African continent. At the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, they sat around a table and drew lines on a map dividing lands and peoples they knew little about, with no regard for political, ethnic, or linguistic boundaries. France was a major player in this scramble, securing a vast swath of territory across North Africa, West Africa, and Central Africa. French West Africa became the jewel in the crown, a territory many times the size of France itself. Beyond Africa, French imperial ambitions continued to expand across the globe. In Southeast Asia, France methodically took control of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, grouping them into French Indochina. The region was prized for resources, rice, rubber, and strategic ports. In the Pacific, France claimed New Caledonia and Tahiti, establishing penal colonies and naval bases. By the early 20th century, the French colonial empire was the second largest in the world, surpassed only by Great Britain, a testament to the scale and relentless pace of this new imperialism. The methods used to establish these new colonies were often ruthless and violent. Superior military technology, such as the machine gun, gave French forces a decisive advantage. Pacification campaigns were waged to crush any and all resistance. Once control was established, a system of administration was put in place. How did a country that, stood up for everyone's rights explain taking over and ruling millions of people around the world? The answer is a strong and common idea called the civilizing mission. It was the belief France was better in terms of race and culture and had a moral duty to bring its ways to people in Africa and in Asia. It made conquest seem like charity, not theft. The idea was taught in French schools, pushed by politicians and sold to the public. They argued French culture, French language, French laws, and French science were the pinnacle of human achievement. So sharing them was framed as a gift. French schools were set up in the colonies, but they mostly created a small class of local French speakers to help run the empire. The French language was framed as modern progress, while local languages and traditions were labeled backward. That mindset damaged people's self-worth for generations. The civilizing mission also appeared in medicine and infrastructure. The French built hospitals, started vaccination campaigns, and built roads, train tracks, and bridges. On the surface, these looked benevolent, but often they served extraction and control. Train lines moved raw materials inland to ports for shipment to France. Hospitals kept European settlers healthy and maintained a local labor force. The empire's projects helped take resources and keep power, not build independent local prosperity. In the end, the civilizing mission was a contradiction, preaching freedom while enforcing strict rule. It claimed to help while exploiting people and resources. It set up a ranking with French rulers at the top and locals at the bottom. Locals were often subjects, not citizens, denied the rights France celebrated at home. That double standard fueled later independence movements. For the millions of people living under French rule, the arrival of the colonizers brought about a complete transformation of their world. The most immediate impact was economic. Traditional ways of life, which had sustained communities for centuries, were often dismantled and replaced by a new colonial economy designed solely to benefit France. Subsistence farming, where people grew food for their own communities, was often replaced by the mandatory cultivation of cash crops like cotton, coffee, and peanuts. These crops were not for local consumption but were destined for export, leaving many communities vulnerable to food shortages if their harvests failed, or if global prices for their crops collapsed. The social fabric of these societies was also profoundly altered. The French administration often imposed new legal systems and property laws that completely disregarded traditional customs and land ownership. In many places, this led to the loss of communal lands, which were then sold to European settlers or corporations. New social hierarchies were created, often by favoring one ethnic or religious group, a tactic of divide and rule that could create lasting tensions. These tactics could erupt in protests or clashes between groups. The small, educated elite of Evolues were often caught between two worlds, not fully accepted by French rulers, but alienated from their own people. Life under colonial rule was also defined by a system of forced labor and taxation. In many parts of the empire, subjects were required to perform unpaid labor, the corvée, building roads, railways, or carrying supplies for colonial officials. It was a system that amounted to temporary slavery and caused immense hardship. Furthermore, new taxes such as the head tax were introduced and often had to be paid in French currency. These taxes forced people to abandon their livelihoods and enter the cash economy, often by working on European-owned plantations or in mines for very low wages. Culturally, the impact was deep and complex. While the civilizing mission sought to impose French values, local cultures did not simply disappear. Instead, a process of adaptation and fusion often took place, creating new hybrid forms of art, music, and religion. However, the psychological impact of being constantly told that your own culture is inferior was immense. It created a colonial mentality, a sense of self-doubt, and a deep-seated belief in the superiority of the colonizer. This was perhaps one of the most subtle yet most enduring legacies of French colonial rule. Resistance to French colonial rule is a story as old as the empire itself. From the very beginning, colonized peoples did not passively accept their subjugation. They fought back in countless ways, small, everyday acts of defiance and large-scale armed uprisings. However, one event stands above all others: the Haitian Revolution. This was not just a rebellion, it was the only successful slave revolt that created an independent nation. The story begins in Saint-Domingue, the most profitable colony in the world. Vast sugar and coffee plantations worked by over 500,000 enslaved Africans in brutal conditions. Inspired by the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity from France, the enslaved population saw their masters' hypocrisy. In August 1791, under leaders like Toussaint Louverture, a brilliant former slave and strategist, a massive coordinated revolt erupted across the northern plains. Plantations were burned, oppressors were attacked in a violent explosion of pent-up fury. What followed was over a decade of complex, brutal warfare. Toussaint proved a master of politics and warfare, organizing a disciplined army and navigating international danger. He drove out foreign invaders and governed the colony for a time. Napoleon sent a massive expeditionary force to reinstate slavery, but the fight continued under Jean-Jacques Dessalines. In 1804, after defeating the French army, Dessalines declared the Republic of Haiti. The name Haiti, from the Taino language, symbolically broke with the colonial past. The revolution sent shockwaves across the Americas and Europe. Slave-owning societies were terrified. Enslaved people could win and form a state. For enslaved people and abolitionists, it was a beacon of hope. The echoes of this revolution inspired countless later freedom movements. The great French Empire, which seemed so permanent and powerful, began to unravel after the Second World War. The war had exhausted France both economically and morally. The spectacle of France itself being occupied by Nazi Germany shattered the myth of European invincibility. Colonized soldiers from Africa and Asia had fought and died for France's freedom. They returned home with a new sense of confidence. A powerful question: if they were good enough to die for France, why were they not good enough to be free citizens in their own countries? The ideals of self-determination, championed by the United States and the Soviet Union, were now spreading across the globe. The process of decolonization was often a painful and violent one. France was reluctant to let go of its empire, which it saw as essential to its status as a great world power. The first major blow came in Indochina. After years of guerrilla warfare, the Viet Minh led by Ho Chi Minh inflicted a stunning military defeat on the French army at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This defeat was a profound humiliation for France and forced it to grant independence to Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. The lesson was clear: a determined nationalist movement could defeat a major European power. The most traumatic chapter of French decolonization unfolded in Algeria. Unlike other colonies, Algeria was legally considered an integral part of France. It was home to over 1 million European settlers, the Pieds Noirs, who fiercely opposed independence. When the Algerian National Liberation Front, the FLN, launched its war for independence in 1954, it began a brutal and bloody conflict that would last for 8 years. The war was characterized by widespread torture, terrorism, and guerrilla warfare, deeply dividing French society and contributing to the collapse of the Fourth Republic. In 1962, despite fierce opposition, President Charles de Gaulle finally granted Algeria its independence. In 1960, often referred to as the Year of Africa, France granted independence to 14 of its African colonies. This was partly a strategic decision to avoid more costly colonial wars like Indochina and Algeria. However, independence was often granted on terms that maintained close economic and political ties with France. The long and complex story of the French colonial empire had finally reached its end, but the process had left deep scars on both the colonizers and the colonized, creating a new set of relationships that would define the post-colonial world. The end of formal colonial rule did not mean the end of French influence. The legacy of empire is a tangled web of connections, political, economic, cultural, that continues to shape the relationship between France and its former colonies to this day. One of the most significant aspects of this legacy is the concept of Francafrique. This term describes the often shadowy network of personal relationships, military agreements, and business dealings. These networks allowed France to maintain influence long after independence. The relationship has been criticized for propping up undemocratic regimes in exchange for access to strategic resources and political loyalty. Economically, many former colonies found themselves locked into a system of dependency. Their economies had been structured for generations to serve the needs of France, focusing on the export of a few raw materials rather than developing a diverse industrial base. France also established the CFA franc, a currency used by many of its former African colonies that was pegged to the French franc, and later the euro. While proponents argue it provides monetary stability, critics claim it limits economic sovereignty and gives France significant leverage. The cultural and linguistic legacy is equally profound. The French language remains an official language in many former colonies and serves as a language of government, business, and higher education. This has created a global community of French speakers known as the Francophonie. While this can foster cultural exchange and provide opportunities, it also represents the enduring influence of the colonial civilizing mission. Debates continue about how to decolonize curricula and give greater prominence to indigenous knowledge and languages. The human legacy of empire is most visible in patterns of migration. people from the former colonies moving to France seeking economic opportunities, education, and refuge. They and their descendants now form a significant part of French society, enriching its culture but also highlighting integration and identity challenges. Issues of racism, discrimination, and the struggle for recognition are central to many post-colonial immigrant communities in France. The nation continues to grapple with its colonial past and what it means to be French in a multicultural society forged by the history of empire. The story is far from over. As we stand here today, on the 28th of August 2025, it is clear that the story of French colonialism is not simply a matter for the history books. Its shadow stretches long into our present, shaping our world in ways both visible and invisible. The borders of many nations in Africa and the Middle East, drawn by colonial administrators with little regard for the people who lived there, continue to be a source of ethnic tension and political instability. The arbitrary lines on a 19th century map can still fuel 21st century conflicts. A stark reminder of how past decisions have consequences that echo across generations. The world we have inherited is, in many ways, a world built by empire. Within France itself, the legacy of colonialism is a subject of intense and often difficult debate. Monuments to colonial figures and street names celebrating military conquests are being questioned. Museum collections filled with artifacts taken from colonized lands are all being re-examined. There is a growing call to confront the darker aspects of this history, the violence, the exploitation, the racism, and to acknowledge the profound harm that was done. The ongoing debates about returning looted cultural artifacts like the Benin bronzes are a direct consequence of this history. These are about justice, restitution, and the right of peoples to their own cultural heritage. They are about attempting to repair some of the damage done during the colonial era. Ultimately, the story of French colonialism is a powerful lesson in the complexities of power, ambition, and human interaction. It reveals the incredible resilience of the human spirit and reminds us that understanding this history is crucial for our shared future.